Together, we're all here announcing the American Victims of Terrorism Compensation Act. This legislation has been a long time coming and will help ensure the viability of the United States Victims of State-Sponsored Terrorism Fund for years to come. There are countless families who have suffered from state-sponsored terrorism, and it calls for immediate and unwavering action. The American Victims of Terrorism Compensation Act answers that call, taking concrete steps to provide support to victims and families of victims alike. The bill ensures an immediate distribution from the U.S. Victims of State-Sponsored Terrorism Fund in 2024. It also establishes required annual payouts from the U.S. VSST Fund annually, helping ensure that victims and their families have a steady source of help. But we're also requiring annual reports to Congress and a comprehensive GAO report every 3 years to ensure the fund remains solvent and is being administered correctly. To that end, we're also doubling the personnel tasked with administering the U.S. VSST Fund, which will help deliver timely and effective assistance to those who rely on it the most. I am deeply proud to be spearheading this bipartisan initiative to help those who need it most. It reaffirms our commitment to support these families and ensure they receive the support that they deserve. This is not a partisan issue. There is broad bipartisan support for this bill in the House, and I know will be in the Senate. As a New Yorker who was in his 5th day of freshman year of high school on September 11th and watched in terror the events of 9/11 and the aftermath. To this day, we still have members of our community dying from 9/11 related illnesses. The impact of terrorism endures well beyond that moment. The families are impacted every day. And to today, we still have new families being impacted. And so this legislation is critical. It is a commitment that we as Americans must make. And I'm proud to help lead this effort. I'm going to ask at this time Angela Mistrulli, daughter of Joseph Mistrulli, a victim, September 11th, 2001, to come up and say a few words.
Good afternoon. Today I stand before you with a heart both heavy and hopeful. We gather to express our gratitude, not just as individuals, but as a collective voice to those who have suffered at the hands of state-sponsored terrorism. We are united not only by the tragedy that befell us, but by the unfulfilled promise made nearly a decade ago to almost 20,000 American victims of state-sponsored terrorism. My father, Joseph Mistrulli, is just one of those victims. His legacy is not only etched in the memories cherished by our family, but also in the very fabric of the city that he helped build. His life was deeply rooted in his work as a union carpenter, but more importantly, in his family. My father was a beacon of light in the lives of all who knew him. He was our rock, and his wisdom guided our paths. His life was taken in an act of cowardice, a senseless act of violence by those who knew nothing of humanity's true values. In one fleeting moment, that light was extinguished by an act of senseless violence. When I lost my father, I missed his physical presence, the warmth of his touch, the sound of his voice, and the comfort of his embrace. His advice, whether solicited or not, shaped my decisions. I miss his guidance. I miss the way he knew just what to say when life threw curveballs at me. In the aftermath of terror, I found myself navigating a labyrinth of loss. Sights, smells, and sounds became a bittersweet reminder of how much we lost that day. The pain of losing a father is immense, but to lose him to an act of state-sponsored terrorism is a burden of a different magnitude. It is in this wound inflicted that the very principles of justice and righteousness that bound us to society. My journey from a terrified teenager 23 years ago has been fraught with challenges that extend beyond the initial trauma. The struggle is not just about coping with the past. It's about facing the present that seems to echo the same patterns of violence and loss. The images and stories emerging from the October 7th attacks resonate with a familiar dread. It has triggered a resurgence of pain, fear, and sorrow that we have carried for decades. United by a shared history of grief and resilience, the recent attacks on October 7th have reopened wounds that many thought had begun to heal. We are reminded of the phone calls that never came, the empty chairs at the dinner table, and the personal stories cut short by acts of terror. The October 7th attacks are a stark reminder that the threat of terrorism remains a painful reality. Our loved ones were not collateral damage. They were victims of deliberate acts. Our loved ones taken from us by acts of calculated violence are much more than statistics. They are the beating hearts of our memories, the laughters in the shared moments, and the dreams left unfulfilled. Terrorism leaves scars that runs deep. Victims suffer physically, emotionally, and financially. Families are shattered, dreams disrupted, and futures forever altered. When Congress created the U.S. VSST Fund in 2015, it was a lifeline for victims. We always knew that full justice would take time. Without taxpayer dollars, we would have to rely on the Department of Justice to bring cases related to state sponsors of terrorism and wait for those cases to bring money into the fund. This is the singular type of case that was made available to us, with funds from all other cases going to help other department priorities. Still, we were grateful for that opportunity to obtain some level of justice. Unfortunately, what has been especially cruel and difficult for the victims is that over the past several years, distributions to victims on their court-awarded judgments has trickled to a halt. This was as surprising to us as we saw DOJ bringing cases and settling them involving state sponsors of terrorism, exactly the type of cases that Congress promised would be used to help us get justice. It is offensive and directly harmful to victims who were targeted simply for being Americans that their own Department of Justice disregards that congressional intent. This is why it is so important to the entire victims community that Representatives Lawler, Malliotakis, Gottheimer, and Goldman have led this bipartisan effort, now already joined by over 20 co-sponsors and counting, to make sure that the promise made to victims in 2015 was not a false promise. I stand before you today not just as a victim, but as a voice of those who have been silenced by the suffering. We stand in solidarity, united against the shadow of terror that has touched our lives in the most personal way. In closing, I urge each and every one of you to take a stand for victims of state-sponsored terrorism everywhere. Together, we can build a future where victimization is met not with silence, but with a chorus of support that resonates across communities. Let us advocate for all victims of state-sponsored terrorism, amplify their voices, and ensure that no one victim is left behind. We must demand justice, not just in words, but in actions. Let us stand together, for in unity there is strength, in remembrance there is solace, and in love there is healing. May this legislation serve as a testament to our shared humanity, a humanity that refuses to be defeated by terrorism.
Thanks, Ann.
Thank you.
This time I'll ask my colleague from New York, Nicole Malliotakis, one of our co-leads, to say a few words.
Thank you to Congressman Mike Lawler for his leadership and for standing with this amazing group of individuals who lost loved ones to terrorism. And as a representative of Staten Island and Brooklyn in New York City, my district was severely impacted. We lost hundreds of individuals. And to this day, we fight to make sure that their families have the support that they deserve. And last year I worked in 2022, worked very closely with Angela to correct a wrong that they had been fighting for 20 years. And I was proud to draft the legislation and thank Congressman Nadler for helping us pass that bill that appropriated funds to the U.S. Victims of State-Sponsored Terrorism Fund to equally compensate the roughly 5,364 victim spouses or dependents that were wrongfully excluded from the initial payments made by that fund. The USVSST fund has failed to operate as Congress originally intended, leading to repeated frustration and heartbreak for victims of state-sponsored terrorism, including those who died on September 11, 2001. I am proud to continue my work on behalf of victims of terrorism by co-sponsoring this legislation. And although financial compensation cannot bring back their loved ones, families in my district and across the country can rebuild their lives with the funds that they are entitled to through their judgments. Our American Victims of Terror Compensation Act will fulfill Congress's promise to never forget, and it will solidify our nation's support for those who have been scarred by horrific acts of terrorism against our country. I thank Mike Lawler for building on the success we had in 2022, and I'm committed to working with him to ensure that this gets adopted as well.
Well, thank you, Congresswoman Malliotakis, who really has been a champion and a leader in New York and here in Washington on behalf of 9/11 families and all victims of state-sponsored terrorism. I want to ask, in addition to Angela, a number of our victims and family members of victims to come forward and say a few words. So I'm going to start with Ann Damerol, who lost a family member in the 1983 Beirut embassy bombing.
Thank you for giving me this opportunity. I am Ann Damerol. I used to work for the Agency for International Development. 1983 was the first time an embassy was bombed. We were targeting Americans just because we were Americans working, hopefully, to make life better. That was a time when we had no clue. We didn't understand what post-traumatic stress was. We didn't grasp the chaos we were living in. Fortunately, after a number of years, decades of surgeries and recovery, I'm fine. You might ask yourself, why is this old lady talking? This old lady is talking because I am totally aware of the impact of any tragedy, especially if you're an American, working for America, loving America. Know how long it takes, step by step, to put your bones together, your mind together, and to survive. I'm working today and talking today about the children. The children to this day are going through tragedy far more superior than what I personally went through. But that is key to me. One sharp hope sprung when the Senate and the Congress got together and they passed legislation and funded a fund that we call the Fund. And it was a wonderful act because it was Republicans, Democrats working together, not for one group, but for everyone. It was the common good. And I sighed, relief, thinking, oh, that's the American way. I can support that, I believe that, and I can tell you, when you're going through trauma, you can't think, you can't act, you can barely breathe. But if there's some stability in your life, you have a sense of calm. And then the fund that was established 15 years ago brought the impartiality into a practical existence, an everyday existence. We didn't have to look to see, oh, well, who's going to lose money because they made a mistake working with Iran? But today, there is no money, there is no water in the well. It needs to be fixed. I don't know how to do that, but I look to Congress to fix it. And that's what I'm here doing today, asking Congress, please take care of these people. They need it. Many people do not have any other hope. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Before we move on to some of our other speakers, I'll ask my colleague, Congressman Josh Gottheimer, a co-lead on this bill from New Jersey, to come up and say a few words.
Thank you so much. I am honored to be here and to lead and help Mike and Nicole and so many other members on the American Victims of Terror Compensation Act. And I know Mr. Goldman is also a leader on this legislation. On 9/11, America experienced the worst terror attack on our soil, on our freedom in history. And those of us who, of course, stand strong to protect democracy and up against terror in all forms, whether that's Hamas, Hezbollah, Palestinian Islamic Jihad, and of course those who attacked on 9/11. We lost nearly 3,000 Americans, including 750 from New Jersey. In an instant, moms and dads were taken away from their families. I think about all those children who have now grown up without parents, robbed of their childhood memories. Congress established a fund in 2015 to support more than 18,000 victims of state sponsors of terror like 9/11, but it hasn't provided enough relief. We need to do more for the families. They've only given 4 distributions in 9 years to the families, and they need more support. Our bill will guarantee the fund can compensate victims and their families this year moving forward. It fully staffs the fund and makes it more accountable to Congress. We must stand against the evils at home and abroad. I can't say that enough, and I want to thank Nicole and Mike for their incredible leadership and everybody who's standing strong here together up against those who've suffered at the hands of terrorists, those who seek to do our country harm and still do today. ISIS, Al-Qaeda, lone wolf terrorists, and against, of course, ever-evolving movements like those threatening our allies right now and or attacking America around the world, all Iranian-backed proxies. The best way to honor those affected by state-sponsored terror attacks is to make sure they receive full justice. Full justice means fair, consistent compensation. This bill is a critical step toward justice. Here in the greatest country that the world has ever known, with God looking over and blessing the victims and the families, I know our best days will always be ahead of us. Thank you, and God bless you.
Thanks, Josh. I'll now ask Bob Chica, a crew member from the USS Pueblo, which was attacked and seized by North Korea in 1968, to come forward and share some thoughts with us.
Thank you. Name's Bob Chica from the USS Pueblo. I want to thank the Congressman for doing this fund. Fund the fund is definitely a necessity in this case. You probably don't even recall the USS Pueblo, but the oldest ship in America is the USS Constitution. The second oldest ship in the United States still commissioned is the USS Pueblo, and it's the only American ship that's still held captive by North Korea. Back when we were captured in '68, I'm here representing the crew along with several men behind me. Dwayne Hodges, a member of the crew, was killed in the attack on the ship. Steve Woke behind me and myself were both seriously wounded and operated on several times by the North Koreans and spent just under a year under their brutal imprisonment. This fund is definitely necessary. The fund has been great, but the idea of funding the fund is what's needed now to make sure the compensation for all the injuries, which have been lifelong for all of us. It's difficult to believe that things that old can still cause this much problem this many years later. And by funding the fund, you would definitely help the rest of us heal and our families. And with that, I'll close. Thank you.
Thank you, Bob. Thank you, Bob.
Thank you.
Grateful for your service. Thank you. Thank you, God, for your service. Thank you.
Now I'll ask Jane Sinisvet, a passenger on the hijacked TWA Flight 847 in 1985, to come and say a few words.
Thank you. My name is Jane Sharp Sinisvet. I am a victim of state-sponsored terrorism. I am proudly here today with other hostages and family members from the TWA Flight 847, a flight that was hijacked in 1985, where we were American citizens on American airline in the hands of the Hezbollah. You may recall we zigzagged all over the Mediterranean where passengers were beaten and tortured. Robert Steedham, a Navy SEAL diver, he was murdered, and his body was thrown onto the airport tarmac for the world to see. The suffering endured by passengers and crew aboard the aircraft was horrific, to say the least, and each of us had these memories for the rest of our lives. I want to thank the sponsors and co-sponsors of this bill, and this is urgently needed to correct the United States Victims for State-Sponsored Terrorism Fund. I call on the Chambers of Congress to move the bill forward as quickly as possible, and I urge the President to support the fund and the fund bill and help to bring the relief to those that have been affected by these heinous acts of terrorism. I am asking Congress, the Senate, and the President to just do the right thing. If acted upon promptly, there could be a distribution in 2024 for all of us. This legislation reinforces a strong message that those responsible for supporting terrorism must be held accountable, and they must pay for these crimes. The U.S. is a country that supports its victims, and it never ceases in the mission to bring terrorists and state sponsors to justice and to hold them accountable. Please keep that in mind, and thank you.
Thank you.
Thank
Jane.
you. Thank you. Thank you.
Now I'll ask Clayton Zook, a disabled Air Force veteran who survived the 1996 Khobar Towers attack, to come up and say a few words.
Clayton Zook, Air Force veteran, Khobar Towers bombing victim. The American Victims of Terrorism Compensation Act.
Wait, one second. Just let it go by. I want everybody to hear your words. They're important.
My last name's Tosh Disease, so that's fitting. Is a crucial piece of legislation that aims to provide much-needed support to those who have been affected by acts of state sponsors of terrorism. I want to extend my gratitude to the leaders in the House, including Representatives Lawler, Malliotakis, Goldman, and Gottheimer. We thank you for their dedication to this important cause. As we approach the anniversary of the tragic events at Khobar Towers, let us remember the 19 airmen who lost their lives and the 400 individuals who were injured. It is important to also acknowledge the other military victims, including those on the USS Pueblo, Marine Barracks, Pentagon veterans of 9/11, and the USS Cole. I urge for the swift passage of this bill to provide assistance to the 18,000 victims, over a third whom are veterans and their immediate family members. There is no distinction between us when it comes to supporting those who have suffered due to state sponsors of terrorism. I call on both chambers of Congress to move this bill as quickly as possible. Time is of the essence. It is imperative that we come together to ensure these victims receive the help and compensation that they deserve. I also urge the President to support this bill and help us bring relief to those who have been affected by terrorism. Let us show our solidarity and compassion for all American victims of state sponsors of terrorism. Thank you.
Thank you, Clayton.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, sir.
That was excellent.
Now I'll ask Aryeh Portnoy to come read a letter from Nahar Neda, whose mother was murdered in Hamas's October 7th attack on Israel.
I'm honored to read this statement by Nahar Neda. As the Congressman mentioned, his mother, Adrienne, was murdered by Hamas terrorists on October 7th. My mom, Adrienne Neda, was born and raised in California. Her father was an Air Force engineer, and the family lived on Navy bases for most of her childhood. She later made Aliyah, and with my dad raised our family in Kibbutz Be'eri. My mom devoted her life to caring for others, regardless of race or religious beliefs. She was a peace and justice seeker who was active in many civilian efforts to bridge the gap between Jews and Arabs in Israel. And then came October 7th. I was at my home in California, and I received an urgent alert from a friend in Israel that something was going on in Be'eri. I immediately called my mother and my father, as I always do when there are security events in Israel, which unfortunately is all too frequent. My father was on vacation in the north, but my mom was in Be'eri. I was grateful to reach my mom on the phone and made sure that she was in the safe room in her house, which would protect her from missile attacks. Unfortunately, missile attacks from Gaza are nothing new in Israel, But then things changed, and I realized for the first time that this was a very different situation from anything we had experienced. My mom told me she heard shouting in Arabic and gunshots outside her house. I immediately connected 2 of my siblings to the call, and we all stayed together with my mom on WhatsApp for several hours. At one point, I had to drop off the call for just a few minutes. My brother called and told me that he and my sister were still on with my mom when they heard the terrorists blast into the house and the call cut off. I later learned that my siblings heard a terrorist ask her in Arabic who she was speaking with. Because my mother had been a hospital midwife caring for Bedouin women, she understood and answered my children. Then there was a shout, and the call cut off. The hours and days ahead were nothing but torture. I flew to Israel the next morning to be with my father and my siblings. We all tried to convince ourselves that my mom would be found alive and okay, but deep down we knew how unlikely that was. It was 5 days of horror before the authorities identified my mother and told us she had been murdered. When I went to Israel for my mother's funeral, I needed to know that this was truly my mother. Maybe there was a mistake with the identification. I asked the undertaker to open the casket, and I saw my mother for the last time murdered by terrorists. Our story is just one of thousands from October 7th. The pain is immeasurable, and nothing can ever make things right. And still, we must go on. Part of that for us is seeking some amount of justice for the immeasurable pain we have only begun to experience. We know the road ahead will be long and hard, and we ask ourselves every day, how can we go on? But we will. And we will keep our mother's memory alive, and we will fight on her behalf in any way we can. We are grateful that Congress has given American victims like us an opportunity to pursue justice in the American courts. We are grateful that Congress created a fund to help the victims, knowing that the countries who are responsible for this cruelty will not honor the judgments against them. It is so hard for us to gather the strength to hold these countries accountable in the courts, and it's even harder to know that we could relive this pain in court and then have nothing at the end if the fund does not work as Congress meant it to work. That is why this bill is so important to us. We recognize it is vitally important to all the victims who came before us and have suffered for so many years. But it is also so very important to us as we fight through our grief, which is so raw, to stand up for what is right. We beg of Congress to remember us and remember all the American victims, those who were killed, those who have been scarred forever, and those who need to come home and find life again. We are all a community that no one should ever have to be a part of, and we know we must stand together. Our message to Congress is simple. Your support for us now is more important than you can know. Please make sure that at the end of our road, we are not forgotten and that none of the victims are forgotten. As Americans, we put our faith in you as our representatives. Please represent us. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
And lastly, before we open it up to any questions, I'll ask Leah Owino and Sam Odundo, children of victims of the 1998 Nairobi embassy bombing, to come and say a few words.
My family and fellow victims would like to express our heartfelt gratitude to the Wheeler firm, their representatives and sponsors for their unwavering diligence in identifying loopholes on our behalf. Their dedication and hard work has not gone unnoticed for all these years. Each time an act of terrorism occurs anywhere in the world, we, as victims of such horrendous acts, are reminded of ours. Today, we are also thankful to Congress for enacting a bill in 2015 to rectify an injustice for victims of terrorism. We fervently hope that their collective efforts will lead to a resolution of issues and delays caused in placing seized assets into the fund and distributing and dispersing payments. We have confidence that these crucial adjustments will move the fund closer to adhering to Congress's initial intentions, guaranteeing that funds collected for the terrorism fund are distributed fairly and consistently to compensate for victims of terrorism in the United States. Thank you.
Again, I want to thank all of the victims and family members who are here today with us. This is a critically important piece of legislation for them to fulfill Congress's promise and to make sure that the fund is fully funded.